The snow had fallen relentlessly through the night, blanketing the streets of Lochdubh in a pristine, almost blinding white. Icicles hung like daggers from the eaves of cottages, and the wind carried the faint, melancholy wail of a distant train whistle. Hamish Macbeth had just finished his last patrol of the evening, his feet crunching against the frosted cobblestones when Constable Sloane intercepted him, eyes wide with a mix of urgency and unease. "Hamish," he said, his voice cutting through the cold. "It's McGregor's place. You need to see this for yourself." Why, the time Hamish arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside the imposing, turreted manor that loomed over the village like a silent sentinel. The front door, polished and heavy, had been left slightly ajar, which immediately set Hamish on alert. There was a faint scent in the air, a mixture of burning pine and something sharper, metallic, that made his stomach tighten. Pushing the door open, he stepped into a grand hallway, its walls lined with ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow him. At the far end, the drawing-room had been disturbed in a way that suggested a struggle. A chair lay toppled, a vase shattered, and the polished floor was streaked with something dark and ominous. Hamish's eyes narrowed at the sight of the body. Mr. Alistair MacGregor, the wealthy, often taciturn owner of the manor, was sprawled across the hearthrug, his face pale, lips slightly parted as if in mid-sentence, "Bah, bah." What struck Hamish most, though, was the unusual clue left behind. Balanced delicately on the mantel above the fire was a single crimson Christmas ornament. Its surface gleamed despite the dust and chaos around it, reflecting the flickering light of the dying fire. Oddly, there was no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the fresh snow that could have belonged to an intruder, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. Yet Hamish had learned long ago that nothing in Lochdubh was ever as straightforward as it seemed. He crouched beside the body, noting the lack of defensive wounds. The angle of the fall suggested he had been struck from behind, or perhaps he had collapsed suddenly. Hamish's trained eye caught a subtle, almost imperceptible smear of mud on the cuff of MacGregor's sleeve. Not much, just a faint trace, but enough to suggest that the scene inside the manor wasn't where the incident had begun. He frowned. A locked room, no sign of a break-in, and an inexplicably placed ornament? It was a puzzle wrapped in contradiction. Lone appeared beside him, shivering from the cold. "No one saw or heard anything, Hamish." "Not a soul. It's like he vanished, then appeared here." Hamish rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Then perhaps he didn't arrive here at all, but he murmured. His eyes drifted back to the ornament. It was a perfect sphere, lacquered with a glossy red that made it seem almost unnatural under the lamplight. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. There was something inside, barely noticeable, a tiny slip of paper rolled so small it was almost invisible. Carefully he extracted it, unfolding it to reveal a cryptic sequence of numbers and letters. L12, F9V3. Hamish's brow furrowed. It was the sort of clue that could mean anything, or nothing at all. He knew MacGregor was fond of riddles, a man who had once challenged Hamish to find a hidden key in his own drawing-room on Christmas Eve, just for sport. Could this be some sort of posthumous puzzle? Or a message left by the perpetrator, a distraction meant to mislead the investigation entirely? The more Hamish considered it, the more the case seemed impossibly complex. Villagers, meanwhile, whispered in small, anxious circles outside the manor. Some claimed they had seen shadows moving between the trees on the edge of the estate. Others insisted they had heard muffled arguments the night before. But all accounts were conflicting, vague, and strangely hollow, as though memory itself was clouded by the weight of snow and fear. Hamish knew he had to tread carefully. Any assumption made too soon could send the investigation spiralling into dead ends. He stood, ornament in hand, and surveyed the scene again. There were no signs of a struggle beyond the toppled furniture. No footprints to indicate anyone had entered or left in the chaos. It was as though the crime had materialized from thin air, leaving only its most baffling token behind. Hamish's instincts screamed that the ornament, innocent as it appeared, was the key to unraveling the mystery. Somewhere in its delicate red curve lay a thread that could pull the entire tangle of the night apart. Outside, the storm had grown harsher, flurries swirling violently against the windows, cutting the manor off from the village like an island of frost. Hamish felt the weight of the task ahead. He would have to untangle not only the physical puzzle of the room, but the hidden motives, the secret relationships, and perhaps even the ghost of old grudges that had haunted the MacGregor family for decades. With a deep breath, he pocketed the ornament, adjusted his scarf, and prepared to interrogate the house staff and villagers, knowing that each answer might only deepen the mystery. In Lochdubh, Hamish thought wryly, Christmas had never ended quietly, but this year it seemed it might never end at all. The puzzle of the crimson ornament, the untraceable movements, and the enigmatic Mr. MacGregor would demand every ounce of his patience and ingenuity. And Hamish, ever the methodical observer, felt a thrill of anticipation. He had walked into a case that was impossibly intricate, a crime that seemed unsolvable, but if anyone could tease out the truth, it would be him. Broke over Lochdubh with a pale icy light that barely pierced the overcast sky. Hamish Macbeth, having spent a restless night turning over possibilities and contradictions, returned to MacGregor's manor with a careful purpose. The storm had subsided slightly, leaving a landscape etched in frost, each branch and railing glittering as though the village had been dusted in sugar. Villagers lingered near the gates, whispering speculations, their breath visible in the cold. Hamish paid them little mind. He knew the truth rarely emerged from gossip. Inside, Constable Sloane had begun the tedious, methodical work of documenting the scene. Furniture was photographed, notes were taken, and the body had been moved to prepare for the coroner. Sloane looked up as Hamish entered, his expression a mix of frustration and awe. "Hamish, you really think we're missing something?" he asked. Hamish didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let his eyes drift over the drawing room once more, noting the details that seemed ordinary but felt off in the unnatural stillness. The polished wood of the mantel, the angle of the rug, the faint trace of ash where the fire had burned unevenly. He crouched by the fireplace again, scanning the area with meticulous care. That ornament, the crimson sphere that had first caught his attention, rested now in his coat pocket, but he couldn't shake the feeling that its placement had been too deliberate. His gaze shifted to the surrounding furniture. Something was slightly askew. A small silver letter, Opa Burr, now protruded from the side of a drawer, polished to a mirror sheen but smudged with fingerprints that had been partially wiped away. Hamish leaned closer, brushing his gloved finger over the faint smudge. A single word, barely legible, was scratched into the wood beneath Yule. It was a trivial-looking detail, yet in Lochdubh, trivialities often held the key. As he moved, he noticed the family portraits on the walls. Their eyes were painted in a way that captured a lifelike vigilance, and yet one of them, a stern-looking MacGregor ancestor, seemed almost pointed in its scrutiny of the hearth. Hamish's attention shifted to a faint impression on the carpet near the fireplace. At first it appeared to be a smudge from the rush of activity, but on closer inspection it was the outline of a boot, though oddly small and delicate. Someone had knelt there, or crouched, perhaps examining or placing something. The detective's instincts prickled. He made a mental note. This was not the work of a hasty intruder. It was deliberate, precise, and calculated. Hamish's examination was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Mrs. Fiona MacGregor, Alistair's sister, standing hesitantly in the doorway. Her expression was carefully composed, but the faint quiver of her hands betrayed unease. "Hamish," she said, her voice measured. I just wanted to see if there's anything I can do to help." Hamish inclined his head gently, sensing both sincerity and a carefully tained veil. "Fiona," he said softly, "sometimes the smallest reactions speak louder than the grandest declarations. Tell me about last night. Every detail matters." She swallowed, glancing toward the window where the frost had formed intricate patterns. "I was in the kitchen, preparing for breakfast. I didn't hear anything unusual, except that I thought I saw someone in the garden through the frost. But I couldn't be certain. Her eyes flickered to the hearth, then away. Hamish noted the hesitation, the slight tension in her posture. A story told perfectly smoothly is often the first sign that something is being withheld. As he returned to the scene, Hamish's eyes caught a small, almost imperceptible detail near the broken vase, a single thread of bright red silk, contrasting starkly with the muted tones of the room. It didn't match any upholstery, drapery, or clothing he could see. He picked it up carefully, recognizing it as deliberately placed rather than accidental. It was a subtle marker, perhaps left by the perpetrator to signal something, or to mislead anyone who found it. The thread, the smudged fingerprints, the barely visible boot print, and the cryptic ornament together formed a pattern of intention that went far beyond a random act. Outside, Sloane fussed over his notes, oblivious to these subtleties, while the local coroner arrived, brisk and procedural, speaking in clipped sentences about cause of death and time of passing. Hamish's mind worked on a different level. Assembling fragments into a framework of possibilities, he was beginning to see the first threads of deception: Mrs. MacGregor's careful demeanour, the misplaced letter opener, the odd positioning of objects. All spoke of someone orchestrating not just a murder, but the appearance of impossibility. Hamish pocketed the red silk thread, stood and surveyed the room one last time before stepping outside. The villagers craned their necks to watch, and he felt the familiar thrill of anticipation settle over him. This was no ordinary case, it was a puzzle layered in misdirection. Already he could sense that the threads of truth were hidden behind careful performances, and only by observing what others overlooked, the tiniest inconsistency, the faintest trace, would the real story emerge. The game was afoot, and Hamish, with his quiet, relentless eye for detail, was exactly the one who could untangle it. Hamish returned to the manor later that morning, the cold having intensified the villagers' whispers into a low hum that seemed to follow him everywhere. The coroner had finished his preliminary observations, declaring MacGregor's death consistent with a sudden internal collapse, though he noted the odd positioning and lack of evidence of natural causes. Hamish, however, was far from convinced. The details, the red ornament, the silk thread, the smudged fingerprints, suggested something far more deliberate, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to baffle and mislead. Bachisa started bar. With the household staff, beginning with Mrs. Fiona MacGregor, who remained in the kitchen, nervously adjusting her scarf. Hamish asked her again to recount the evening in detail. Her story was precise, almost too precise. She had prepared tea for her brother at 7, tidied the drawing-room by 8, and had gone to bed shortly thereafter. Yet as she spoke, Hamish noticed her eyes flicking toward the window when she mentioned the drawing-room, a subtle, involuntary motion that betrayed anxiety. Ext, he spoke with the housemaid, young Elspeth, who had been sent to fetch supplies when the incident occurred. Her account differed in small but telling ways. She claimed she had seen the lights in the drawing-room flicker as she passed by, and that she heard a muffled thump, though she hadn't dared enter. Hamish noted that her timing conflicted slightly with Fiona's, and when pressed gently, she admitted that she had lingered outside longer than she first said, curious but fearful. The inconsistencies were minor, yet in Lochdubh, minor inconsistencies often concealed major truths. Hamish then sought out the gardener, Mr. Wallace, a man as solid and unassuming as the frost-covered hedges he tended. Wallace's story seemed straightforward at first. He had been in the garden tending the winter greenhouse, and had noticed nothing amiss. Yet the minute Hamish asked about footprints in the snow, Wallace hesitated, muttered something about the frost, making it hard to see, and quickly changed the subject. Hamish made a mental note. Either Wallace was protecting someone, or he had been present at a moment he wasn't meant to admit. The village itself added another layer of complexity. Several neighbours had claimed to see shadows flitting between the trees of MacGregor's estate the night before, but their accounts varied wildly. One insisted a man had been carrying something, another swore it had been a woman, and a third, who had only peered through frost-laden glass, was unsure of anything at all. Yet in each story Hamish detected a common thread, a sense of fear, a hesitation to commit fully to the narrative. Someone, he realized, was trying to guide attention away from the truth. Returning to the manor, Hamish observed Fiona again. She appeared eager to cooperate, offering information without being asked, yet the eagerness itself was peculiar. It was a performance, a mask, and Hamish could sense it. He pressed subtly, questioning the staff about last-minute errands, forgotten objects, and the locations of keys and personal belongings. Each time, small contradictions emerged, a drawer reported empty by one, half full by another, a hallway passage claimed untravelled by one, yet footprints suggested otherwise. Then, as he gathered statements, Hamish's attention was drawn to the subtle details in the room, the faint scuff mark on the wooden floor leading toward the library, the slight tilt of a picture frame on the landing, and the barely noticeable smudge on the sidebar of the windowsill. Each clue seemed insignificant in isolation, yet together they hinted at movement and manipulation that no outsider could have executed without intimate knowledge of the house. By mid-afternoon, Hamish called everyone together under the pretense of reviewing events. He observed reactions closely. Fiona's composure barely flickered when others spoke, yet she shifted minutely whenever he mentioned the drawing room or the red ornament. Elspeth, the maid, fidgeted with her apron, eyes darting to Wallace when certain questions were asked. Wallace's sturdy frame was rigid, jaw tight, and he avoided direct eye contact, focusing instead on the snow beyond the window. Each reaction, each hesitation, was a thread in the web. Hamish was beginning to map in his mind. By the time the group dispersed, Hamish knew that deception was woven through every statement. The inconsistencies weren't random. They were deliberate, shielding a truth someone desperately wanted to conceal. There was motive behind the eagerness, the silence, and the half-truths. But what remained elusive was the form it would take. Was it a calculated act of greed, revenge, or some older, more tangled grievance? As Hamish stood alone in the drawing-room once more, his gaze fell on the hearth, the shattered vase, and the crimson ornament now resting in his palm. The pieces were starting to align, but the picture remained incomplete. Somewhere within the contradictions, he realized, lay the path to clarity. A path he intended to follow, step by meticulous step. Hamish spent the evening in quiet contemplation, the manor settling into a brittle silence broken only by the occasional groan of timber contracting in the frost. He spread his notes across the library table, each sheet covered with observations, contradictions, and subtle clues he had gathered over the day. The red ornament rested nearby, its glossy surface reflecting the lamplight, a reminder that sometimes the simplest things concealed the most intricate secrets. Hamish began to trace connections, linking the half-truths and omissions he had observed into patterns that might reveal motive. Fiona MacGregor's name rose to the forefront. Her composure had been impeccable, yet it had felt rehearsed, almost like a performance to guide the investigation away from certain truths. Hamish considered her position within the family. As Alistair's sister, she stood to inherit a significant portion of the estate in the event of his death, and there had been whispered disputes over management of family investments, particularly regarding the new development project that MacGregor had recently opposed. Jealousy and ambition could easily have driven someone who appeared so polished. Yet, Fiona's meticulous timing and knowledge of household routines suggested she would have needed an accomplice to carry out anything beyond minor mischief. Speth, the young maid, was another figure tangled in the web. Her nervousness and the conflicting details of her story suggested fear of discovery, or perhaps fear of something she had witnessed and had been instructed to conceal. Hamish wondered whether she had stumbled across more than she admitted, and whether that fear had escalated into complicity. Young as she was, her position gave her access to every room, every key, every subtle movement within the manor. She could be a pawn, but even pawns, if cornered or motivated, could turn into agents of more significant action. Then there was Wallace, the gardener. At first glance he seemed a man of simple routines, tending to hedges and greenhouses with steadfast dedication, but Hamish remembered the hesitation when footprints and paths were mentioned. Wallace had access to the grounds at all hours, knowledge of every hidden passage, every side door. If someone had planned a carefully orchestrated crime, he would have been the ideal accomplice, or, alternatively, the reluctant participant protecting someone else. His loyalty to the MacGregor family was reputed, but loyalty could mask resentment or an unspoken grudge. Hamish considered the relationships among the three. Fiona and Wallace had often crossed paths over garden projects. Elspeth had been in the household for several seasons and had observed tensions, private arguments and minor quarrels that others would have ignored. Each of their motives had shades and shadows, greed, certainly, but also jealousy, fear, and the desire to maintain appearances. Nothing alone. Nothing could be considered in isolation. The murder was not merely a product of opportunity, it was a culmination of intertwined desires, carefully hidden grievances, and perhaps an element of chance. He reviewed the physical evidence once more, the smudged fingerprints on the letter opener, the faint boot imprint near the fireplace, the red silk thread, and the cryptic message inside the ornament. Each item hinted at deliberation and planning, yet each also allowed for misdirection. Someone wanted the death to seem either accidental or impossible, yet in doing so, they had created a trail only a keen observer could follow. The challenge lay not only in identifying who had acted, but in understanding the motivations that had driven them. Hamish jotted down a list of potential scenarios, tracing the sequence of events backward from discovery to act. He considered who had access to keys, who had the knowledge of household routines, who might have observed vulnerabilities, and who could manipulate appearances. In every scenario, the motive was layered. Financial interest intertwined with personal grievances, resentment intersected with fear, ambition collided with loyalty. The tangle was dense, yet Hamish knew that careful observation and methodical questioning could untangle it. By late evening, he had constructed a web of possibilities that connected the key players through both opportunity and motive. Each thread was fragile, dependent on assumptions that still read confirmation, yet the framework was emerging. Hamish leaned back in his chair, the glow of the lamplight casting shadows that danced across the room, reflecting the complexities he sought to unravel. Somewhere within the contradictions, the half-truths and the concealed resentments lay the decisive clue, the action that would illuminate the maze of motives and reveal the one who had orchestrated the night that Christmas never ended. Hamish's mind, ever alert, began to plan the next steps. More pointed questioning, subtle observation, and watching for reactions that betrayed hidden anxieties. The threads of deceit were numerous but not infinite, and with patience and insight, the pattern could be discerned. The tangled motives of Fiona, Elspeth, and Wallace would gradually unravel, revealing the human drives that had culminated in Alistair MacGregor's untimely death. For Hamish, the puzzle was as exhilarating as it was daunting, and he felt the familiar thrill of the chase settle into a quiet, determined focus. He next morning brought a brittle clarity to Lochdubh, the frost catching the weak winter sun and scattering it across the village in shards of glittering light. Hamish returned to the manor early, a sense of anticipation undercut by the gnawing caution that had guided him since the first moment he stepped inside. Constable Sloane met him at the gate, his breath visible in the cold air. A bundle of excitement barely contained. "Hamish, you'll never believe it. Old, waving a small leather-bound notebook. Elspeth found it, in the greenhouse behind some pots. "I think we've got him." Hamish's eyes narrowed slightly, and he followed Sloane inside, the thrill in the constable's tone tempered by the detective's growing unease. Elspeth had indeed discovered a notebook, its pages filled with erratic handwriting, threats, calculations and notes regarding family finances. The handwriting seemed familiar, almost identical to samples taken from a letter in Fiona's private study. The coroner, the villagers, and even Sloane were quick to declare the case solved. Fiona MacGregor, it seemed, had acted out of a combination of greed and resentment, driven to orchestrate her brother's death and cover it with an elaborate ruse. The excitement in the room was palpable. Statements were revisited, alibis were re-examined, and everything began to fit neatly into a narrative that satisfied both logic and human expectation. Fiona's earlier composure, her knowledge of household routines, and her proximity to key locations now appeared incriminating. Sloane was already preparing to arrest her, and a sense of relief seemed to settle over the manor, as if a shadow that had hung over Lochdubh was finally lifting. But Hamish remained quiet, the notebook lying open before him. Something about the neatness of the solution felt forced, too tidy, as though someone had arranged the pieces just so, hoping that others would accept the apparent clarity. He examined the PBR bar, ages more closely, noting the style of the entries. They were deliberate, almost theatrical, emphasizing frustration and financial grievance in a way that seemed intended for discovery. The handwriting, he realized, could be mimicked, and the content itself could have been planted to mislead any observer. Hamish glanced at Fiona, seated calmly, hands folded, eyes following every movement with practiced restraint. She appeared guilty, certainly, but so did a skilled actor playing the part of guilt, and in this room, filled with villagers, staff and law enforcement, the opportunity for a carefully staged performance was immense. Something in the alignment of the notebook, the timing of its discovery, and the reactions it provoked felt orchestrated rather than coincidental. He rose and walked toward the fireplace, letting his eyes drift over the familiar clues, the red ornament, the smudged fingerprints on the letter opener, the red silk thread still pinned to a corner of the rug. None of these had changed overnight. None had been addressed by the notebook. Yet they continued to tug at Hamish's instincts, suggesting an unseen hand manipulating events from behind the scenes. A true solution, he suspected, would account for them, not ignore them. Outside, the village continued to stir with excitement. The story of Fiona's guilt had begun to take hold, whispers turning to certainty, certainty into triumph. Hamish watched from the window, feeling the tension coil tighter in his chest. He had seen this pattern before, an apparent resolution, a collective sigh of relief, only for the real truth to emerge later, catching everyone off guard. He suspected that the true criminal had anticipated the rush to judgment, and had used it as a cover, hiding in plain sight, while the authorities celebrated a victory that was far from genuine. Hamish sat back at the library table, studying the ornament again. It glimmered in the weak sunlight, its reflection dancing across the polished surface of the wood. The cryptic message inside, the misplaced thread, the boot mark, they all spoke of someone meticulous, someone patient, someone who thrived in the shadows. And this person, Hamish realized why. The tightening of the gut was still at large, watching the unraveling of a false narrative with the satisfaction of a predator whose prey had yet to realize the danger. He closed the notebook carefully, his expression calm but focused. The village believed the case solved. The authorities believed they had triumphed. Even Fiona, for all her apparent guilt, remained composed. But Hamish knew better. The real criminal was still moving unseen, calculating the next step, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And when that moment came, Hamish intended to be ready, the shadows themselves unwilling to conceal the truth from him. Hamish spent the late afternoon wandering the quiet halls of MacGregor Manor, retracing the paths he had observed the day before. The villagers had left, the excitement over Fiona's supposed guilt still humming faintly in the air outside, and inside the manor, the silence felt almost sacred. Hamish's mind wandered back to the seemingly minor inconsistencies that had lingered in his memory, a shadow flitting across the frost-covered window panes, a fragment of conversation half overheard, a gesture repeated with an unusual rigidity. It was these small, almost imperceptible details that often carried the weight of revelation. He returned to the library, where the red ornament still lay on the polished table, a silent witness to the chaos of the previous days. As he examined it again, he noticed a faint impression on its surface, barely visible unless S caught in the light at a certain angle. It wasn't a scratch, not quite, but more like an etching, a symbol he didn't immediately recognize. It stirred something distant in his memory, a faint echo of a case he had encountered years ago in the Highlands, a dispute over land and inheritance that had ended with no conviction but had left its mark on those involved. Hamish's brow furrowed. The sensation of déjà vu was not easily ignored. He pulled the manor's archives from the shelves, old ledgers, correspondence, and family records dating back decades. What caught his eye was a small folded note, yellowed with age, tucked behind the spine of a ledger. It detailed a clandestine arrangement between the MacGregor family and a neighbouring estate, the MacAllisters, concerning disputed property rights and a secret loan that had been called in abruptly. What struck Hamish most was the handwriting. It matched the style of some of the recent entries in the notebook found in the greenhouse. Could this be a coincidence? Or was someone deliberately echoing history, weaving old grievances into present-day motives? H made his way to the greenhouse, following the path that Elspeth had claimed to have taken when discovering the notebook. The faint frost on the glass panes reflected the late winter light, and as Hamish moved closer, he noticed a corner of the floorboards slightly raised. With care, he pried it open to reveal a small compartment containing letters, photographs, and an old key, Lochdubh, in forgotten. The letters revealed a connection between Fiona and Wallace, written in a time before the current generation had grown into prominence. There were hints of financial disputes, of jealousies simmering beneath polite exchanges, and of promises made and broken. Hamish realised that the threads of the past were entwined with those of the present, and that the current events could not be fully understood without acknowledging the shadow cast by history. He sat for a moment on the frost-dusted bench, piecing together the implications, the red silk thread, the cryptic ornament, the seemingly planted notebook. These could all be attempts to echo or manipulate historical grievances, creating a narrative that suggested one culprit while concealing a deeper, more intricate web. The connections between Fiona and Wallace, previously dismissed as incidental, were in fact rooted in decades of family entanglements, unspoken debts, and lingering resentment. And Elspeth, though younger and less experienced, might have been drawn into the patterns laid down long before she had even been born. Hamish's instincts sharpened as he considered the significance of the key. It fit a lock in the manor's old storage room, one that had been long forgotten, and inside he found more documents, contracts, financial statements, and a small ledger documenting payments and threats exchanged between family members and external associates. The records revealed not just disputes over money, but subtle manipulations, favours owed, and old grudges that had been carefully nurtured over the years. Here, in the quiet dust of neglected paperwork, lay a map of human motives far more complex than the authorities had imagined. The detective leaned back, the weight of realization pressing on him. The murder, he understood now, was not merely a response to immediate circumstances, but the culmination of decades of tension, jealousy, and carefully hidden resentments. It was as though the past had waited, patient and silent, for the right moment to assert itself, and someone with knowledge of history and an eye for manipulation, had seized that moment with the precision of a master. Hamish rose, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in his mind. The crime was no longer a simple act of greed or frustration. It was an echo of old rivalries, orchestrated to appear random and confusing, a deliberate mirror of conflicts long buried. And in that mirror, the true criminal was still moving, unseen, weaving the threads of past and present into a tapestry that only Hamish had begun to unravel. The shadows of the past, he realized, were not mere memories. They were active players, shaping the present with quiet, insidious intent. Hamish spent the following morning reviewing the connections he had unearthed, pacing the long hallway of MacGregor Manor, boots echoing softly against the polished floorboards. The old grievances, the hidden letters, the patterns of jealousy and resentment, all formed a dense web, but the strands were still incomplete. He realized that he needed a method to draw out reactions, to prompt someone into revealing what careful words and rehearsed stories had so far concealed. He gathered Fiona, Elspeth, and Wallace in the drawing room, presenting them as though to discuss the events chronologically. His tone was casual, almost conversational, but Hamish had a plan. He placed the red ornament in the centre of the table, along with the silk thread and the letter opener, and began to speak of the past, not the immediate events of the murder, but the old disputes, the long-forgotten contracts, the obscure letters in the storage room. He recounted the history with meticulous accuracy, sprinkling in details that only someone intimately familiar with the family's secrets could recognize. As he spoke, Hamish watched their faces carefully. Fiona maintained her composure, hands folded neatly, but her fingers twitched subtly when he mentioned a specific financial arrangement that had involved her directly decades ago. Elspeth looked down at her apron, biting her lip, her eyes flitting between Hamish and the doorway, while Wallace's S-posture stiffened, a slight blanch crossing his cheeks when he heard a reference to the old McAllister dispute. The room felt charged, the silence pressing, as if each word weighed heavily on them. Hamish leaned forward, lowering his voice, and spoke of the small, overlooked details that had seemed insignificant the authorities, the faint boot print near the fireplace, the smudge on the window-sill, the placement of the ornament and silk thread. Each of these, he said, tapping the table gently, requires not just opportunity, but knowledge of the manner, of the routines, and perhaps, most importantly, a sense of timing. Someone knew exactly how events would unfold. Someone who understood history and human nature in equal measure. He observed closely as Fiona's eyes flickered to the ornament, then to the window where the frost had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth beneath. There was a micro-expression, a brief tightening around her mouth, almost imperceptible. But Hamish caught it. Wallace, meanwhile, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearing his throat several times, a telltale sign of agitation. Elspeth's hands clenched into small fists in her lap, and she avoided looking directly at Hamish, yet her ears were straining forward, clearly absorbing every word. Hamish decided to employ a subtle psychological test. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small velvet-lined box, opening it to reveal a second, nearly identical crimson ornament, its surface pristine. "I've been told," he said lightly, "that sometimes criminals leave symbols, messages, or tokens that are meant to mislead. Suppose, just for a moment, someone wanted to see if others would notice the difference, or react in a particular way. How easy would it be to plant a second ornament, almost identical, and observe?" At the mention of the second ornament, Fiona's hand trembled slightly, brushing against her scarf as if to steady herself. Wallace's eyes narrowed for a heartbeat, then darted toward the door, calculating, measuring. Elspeth let out a shallow breath, as though she had been holding it, and her fingers uncurled, revealing the red thread she had been unconsciously fidgeting with. Hamish's gaze lingered on her. The reaction was subtle, yet telling. She had responded instinctively to the suggestion of deception. Hamish allowed a quiet pause, watching how each of them processed the information. The psychological pressure, applied delicately and without accusation, had revealed cracks. He did not need confessions, not yet. These micro-reactions, involuntary and fleeting, offered more insight than words alone could convey. Someone's carefully constructed facade had shifted, if only for a moment, and Hamish knew these glimpses of truth were invaluable. He closed the box with a soft click, setting it back on the table. "Sometimes," he said, almost casually, "truth hides behind what people think is unobserved. Small acts, subtle gestures, unguarded reactions. They can speak louder than 1,000 declarations." His eyes swept across the three faces before him, lingering on the subtle signs that betrayed unease. Hamish felt the first tangible threads of certainty forming, the unseen hand manipulating events, drawing on past grievances and present fears, had revealed itself in a momentary lapse. And in that lapse, he sensed, lay the next step toward untangling the full story of that night, when Christmas never ended. Hamish had been reviewing the subtle reactions of Fiona, Wallace, and Elspeth, mentally piecing together the chain of events that had led to Alistair MacGregor's death, when a sharp knock echoed through the drawing-room. Constable Sloane entered, face pale and voice tight. "Hamish, the notebook, it's gone." Hamish froze, the words striking like a sudden gust of wind. "Gone?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Sloane nodded, wringing his hands. "It was here, right on the table. I stepped out for a moment to fetch the coroner's gloves, and when I came back, nothing. No trace. No sign of forced entry." Hamish rose slowly, his mind racing. The notebook had been the key to the apparent breakthrough, a bridge between past and present motives, carefully linking grievances, financial disputes, and small acts of deceit. Without it, the narrative that had seemed to clarify the investigation now hung in uncertainty. Someone had deliberately removed it, and the implication was unmistakable. The real perpetrator was still active, and was now acting to bury evidence, to obscure the path Hamish had begun to trace. He moved quickly, examining the table and surrounding floor for any overlooked signs. There were none, not a footprint, not a smudge, not even a single fibre out of place. Whoever had taken the notebook had done so with precision, and with knowledge of the manor's routines. Hamish felt a cold thrill of recognition. The same meticulous hand that had orchestrated the murder and manipulated the clues was now actively trying to control the investigation, removing evidence before it could be fully analysed. He turned to the three in the room. Fiona's calm composure remained, though her eyes flicked to the empty table with a trace of concern. Wallace straightened abruptly, clearing his throat, hands tightening at his sides. Elspeth's face paled, and she bit her lip, glancing furtively toward the door. Hamish knew that this sudden disappearance of the notebook would provoke reactions, even subtle ones, that could reveal something more than words ever could. "Someone wanted this hidden," Hamish said quietly, pacing along the length of the rug. "It's not just about the notebook itself. It's about controlling the narrative, burying a truth someone doesn't want anyone to uncover. And they had the opportunity, knowledge, and timing to do it perfectly." He stopped and looked at Elspeth. "You found it first, yes? Did anyone approach you? Did you see anyone near the greenhouse or the drawing room after you retrieved it?" Elspeth shook her head quickly. "No, no one. I brought it here myself. I didn't touch it after that. I left it for you." Her voice wavered slightly, betraying fear or perhaps relief at speaking the truth. Hamish nodded, noting the honesty, the micro signs of stress that lined her expression. He shifted his attention to Wallace and Fiona, observing the smallest cues, the tightening of a jaw, the subtle shift of weight, the fraction of a second when eyes avoided his. Hamish realised that the removal of the notebook had not just eliminated a piece of evidence, it had forced reactions to the surface, cracks in composure that were far more telling than the document itself. Whoever had done this was watching, anticipating the investigation's steps, and confident that the authorities would be distracted by the apparent chaos. Hamish took a deep breath, steadying himself. The stakes had risen. Trust was now a fragile thing within the manor. Every glance, every gesture, every hesitation could be both a signal and a trap. The perpetrator was not just hiding evidence, they were manipulating perception, shaping the story that others would believe. And Hamish knew that the next hours would be crucial. He moved to the window, staring out at the frost-glittered gardens, thinking through the sequence of events. If the notebook had been taken from the drawing room without leaving a trace, then the act had been planned, precise, and likely involved intimate knowledge of household routines. That narrowed the field, but it also intensified the danger. Whoever was behind this was close, patient, and cunning, and they would not hesitate to act again if Hamish allowed even the smallest misstep. The detective's gaze returned to the empty table, the red ornament gleaming innocently nearby. It was a reminder that even in the absence of physical evidence, the truth left traces, gestures, micro-expressions, patterns of behaviour. Hamish knew that the path to uncovering the real criminal now depended less on what had been stolen and more on watching the living. In the quiet of the manor, the shadows seemed to deepen, and Hamish felt the familiar rush of anticipation, knowing that the case was no longer a matter of simple observation, but of reading the subtle language of deception in real time. Hamish had barely begun to recalibrate after the disappearance of the notebook when the manor was jolted by a sudden, panicked commotion from the kitchen. He sprinted down the corridor, boots slipping slightly on the frost-traced floor, and found Sloane at the doorway, face ashen. "Hamish, it's Wallace," he gasped. He's gone. The back gate is open and there's blood." Hamish's heart quickened. He pushed past Sloane into the garden, the early afternoon sun casting sharp shadows over the frost-bitten shrubs. Near the greenhouse, a shallow pool of blood gleamed on the snow, leading toward the boundary fence. Hamish followed the trail, observing carefully, noting the lack of footprints except for Wallace's. which ended abruptly at the edge of the property. Someone had taken him, and done so with speed, efficiency, and planning. The realization struck Hamish with a cold certainty. The person responsible for MacGregor's death and the stolen notebook was still active and several steps ahead. This was no longer simply a matter of piecing together past motives. It was now about immediate danger. The stakes had escalated. The perpetrator was willing to threaten, intimidate, or eliminate anyone who posed a risk of exposure. Wallace had likely stumbled upon something the criminal did not intend to be discovered, and now the consequences were unfolding in real time. Hamish scanned the perimeter of the estate, noting the gate latch was tampered with, small scratch marks revealing the use of a tool designed to leave no trace. Whoever had done this understood the manor's routines intimately, knew the locations of all the keys, and had anticipated the likelihood of pursuit. The subtle artistry of the act, the lack of struggle, the precision of the entry and exit, was the same meticulous hand that had orchestrated MacGregor's murder and removed the notebook. Baba. Inside, Fiona and Elspeth were visibly shaken. Fiona clutched the edge of the mantelpiece, her usual composure faltering as she processed the news, while Elspeth's hands trembled, the red silk thread she had fidgeted with earlier slipping from her fingers onto the floor. Hamish's gaze swept across their faces, observing reactions with the precision of a hawk. Fear was palpable, but so was calculation. The criminal had clearly intended to provoke a sense of panic and disorientation. Hamish recognized that reading their responses now would be crucial, for even the slightest slip might reveal complicity, or at least knowledge, of what had occurred. Hamish turned his attention outward, deciding that containment and observation were paramount. He stationed Sloane at the remaining entrances, and together they began a methodical sweep of the estate. Every window, every door, every likely hiding place was checked, but Wallace was nowhere to be found. The absence was chilling, emphasizing the calculated control of the perpetrator. Hamish felt the weight of the situation settle heavily. He was no longer merely investigating a historical web of grievances, he was navigating an active battlefield, one in which failure could cost lives. As he paused near the greenhouse, Hamish's eyes caught the glint of something partially buried beneath the frost-laden flower-beds, a silver cufflink, one of Wallace's, engraved with a subtle monogram. It was a clue, left either intentionally or by accident, that the criminal had underestimated the detective's patience and attentiveness. Hamish pocketed it. Understanding its dual purpose, it confirmed Wallace's path and acted as a psychological signal, a message from someone confident they could stay ahead. Hamish returned to the manor, rallying Fiona and Elspeth to stay within sight while he devised a plan to anticipate the perpetrator's next move. The criminal was calculating, precise, and willing to escalate at any moment. The case had transformed from a puzzle of motives and historical grudges into a high-stakes contest of wit, timing, and vigilance. He knew the path forward would require blending patience with boldness, observing every reaction, every minor gesture, and anticipating the moves of a mind that had proven frighteningly adept at staying several steps ahead. The realization left Hamish with a grim resolve. The murderer, the manipulator of past grievances and present deceptions, was not merely hiding. They were hunting, and Lochdubh itself was the stage. The detective now faced the dual task of unraveling the intricate web of the past and preventing further tragedies, knowing that the next strike could come without warning, and that only his vigilance, insight, and methodical cunning could stop it. The shadows had grown longer, and the game had intensified. Christmas had never been more perilous, and for Hamish Macbeth, the true challenge was only beginning. Hamish returned to the manor late that afternoon, the chill in the air mingling with the tension that had settled over the household. The garden was silent now, snow undisturbed except for the faint trace of footprints he had marked earlier, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Wallace's disappearance weighed heavily on him, but Hamish knew that rushing recklessly could only play into the criminal's hands. He needed clarity, a thread to tie together the chaos of the last few days. He seated himself at the library table, eyes sweeping over the scattered evidence. The red ornament, the silk thread, the letter opener, and the small cufflink he had recovered from the garden. Each had seemed independent, a series of disconnected curiosities and clues, but Hamish's instincts nudged him to look closer, to search for the invisible lines that connected them. He reread his notes, watching the subtle contradictions in statements, the hesitations, the micro-expressions that had betrayed unease, and then, almost imperceptibly, a detail clicked. It was a remark Fiona had made 2 days before, casual in tone, almost dismissive, as they discussed household routines. "I always leave the greenhouse door unlocked for the winter feeding of the plants. It's easier that way." At the time, Hamish had barely registered it, noting only the familiar practicality of her habits, but now, in the context of Wallace's disappearance and the notebook's removal, the comment took on a new significance. It wasn't simply a habit, it was a pattern, a predictab. La vulnerability, a point of access that only someone who knew the house well, or had been taught, could exploit. Hamish's gaze shifted to the red silk thread, its location near the broken vase suddenly aligning with that pattern. The thread had been placed as a subtle signal, perhaps for the benefit of the perpetrator themselves, or as a calculated misdirection. The red ornament, gleaming innocently on the mantle, was no longer merely a symbol. Its position, its content, and the timing of its discovery were all part of a sequence, a breadcrumb trail of deliberate choices designed to guide attention while concealing true intent. The detective leaned back, running a hand through his hair, and considered the implications. Each act of the criminal, removing the notebook, orchestrating Wallace's disappearance, manipulating the responses of the household, followed the same logic. There was a rhythm to the chaos, a deliberate pattern of timing, misdirection, and psychological pressure. The hand that had struck at MacGregor, the mind that had anticipated every response, was methodical, and its movements were now readable to someone who knew where to look. Hamish rose, moving through the drawing room with deliberate steps, eyes scanning the familiar furnishings as if seeing them anew. The fireplace, the toppled chair, the faint boot mark, all pieces of a sequence he now understood. The criminal had relied on predictable behaviours, unguarded moments, and the natural assumptions of those Aruba. Bah! ND them! And yet in those very details, Hamish found the opportunity to anticipate the next move. Small habits, repeated patterns, even the placement of a seemingly inconsequential object could reveal the mind behind the crime. He returned to the library table, spreading out the evidence once more, mentally mapping the chain of events. The notebook, though missing, had not been taken at random. It had been seized with a knowledge of its content and an understanding of what its absence would provoke. Wallace had been removed because he had seen or inferred too much, and the red ornament had been placed to distract, to focus attention away from the real pathways of action. Hamish realized that the key was not hidden in dramatic gestures or extraordinary evidence. It had been in the predictable, the habitual, and the overlooked all along. A smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The criminal had underestimated the value of ordinary observation, of patience, and of paying attention to the seemingly insignificant. Hamish now held a clear mental map of the sequence of moves and countermoves, and he understood the logic behind them. The chaos was intentional, but it was also structured, and structure, once recognized, could be exploited. As he leaned back, considering the steps ahead, Hamish felt the familiar thrill of clarity settle over him. The pattern was emerging, and with it, the possibility of anticipating the next move, rescuing Wallace, and finally confronting the mind He had orchestrated the nightmarish events that had plunged Lochdubh into uncertainty. What had once seemed random was now a blueprint, and Hamish knew that the final act of the drama was only moments away. Hamish had spent the evening reconstructing the subtle patterns, tracing the rhythm of the criminal's movements, and observing the household with renewed vigilance. The manor, quiet now in the deepening winter dusk, seemed almost to hold its breath, the frost outside shimmering faintly against the fading light. He had pieced together the sequence of events, predicted the perpetrator's logic, and understood the habitual weaknesses they had exploited. What remained unclear, however, was the why, the hidden motive that had driven such calculated cruelty. The breakthrough came unexpectedly as Hamish revisited the old letters and ledgers he had found in the storage compartment. One letter, yellowed and folded several times, had been written decades ago but never sent. It detailed a quiet obsession, a resentment not against money, power, or inheritance, but against perceived slights, disappointments, and the sense of being overlooked, dismissed, or undervalued. The author, whose handwriting mirrored that in the stolen notebook, had felt a lifelong need to assert control, to orchestrate events in a manner that ensured attention, dominance, and recognition, even if only posthumously through carefully crafted consequences. Hamish leaned back, absorbing the full weight of the revelat. The criminal had acted not merely from avarice or jealousy, but from a deeper psychological compulsion, a need to dominate and control the narrative, to reshape reality itself according to their own design. Every misdirection, every stolen object, every carefully placed clue had been a statement. The world would bend to their will, and any opposition would be eliminated, manipulated, or frightened into submission. The murders, the disappearance of Wallace, the stolen notebook, and the intricate misdirection were all part of a performance, a demonstration of intellect, precision, and psychological mastery. As Hamish reflected, he realized that this motive explained the pattern of careful, theatrical gestures that had so confounded the authorities. The red ornament, the silk thread, even the falsified notebook had not been planted merely to confuse. They were deliberate instruments, designed to provoke reactions, to test patience and perception, to establish a sense of dominance over everyone in the manor. The criminal had relished the suspense, the tension, and the uncertainty, deriving satisfaction from the fear and confusion they had sown. Turning his attention to the household, Hamish examined Fiona, Elspeth, and Wallace, or rather the absence of Wallace and the reactions of the remaining two. The subtle anxieties he had observed earlier, now seen in light of the psychological motive, were pieces of a larger tableau. Fiona's composure masked a careful negotiation with fear. Elspeth's nervous fidgeting revealed an instinctive response to someone far more dangerous than she had initially realized. Each micro-reaction was a window into the criminal's influence, a reflection of the power they wielded simply by understanding human psychology. Hamish's eyes drifted back to the letters, to the diagrams of past grievances intertwined with present disputes. The realization crystallized. The motive was rooted in a need for validation and mastery. The criminal had acted to prove, first to themselves and second to the world, that they could orchestrate an event beyond comprehension, manipulating both past and present to create a scenario in which they alone held the keys to truth and resolution. The extreme measures, the murders, the disappearances, the stolen evidence, were the natural culmination of this compulsive drive. In that moment, Hamish understood why conventional assumptions, greed, inheritance, revenge, had led the authorities astray. The perpetrator's psychology was far more complex, a combination of obsession, intellect, and the desire for absolute control. The crime was not reactive. It had been carefully, patiently constructed, anticipating every countermeasure, every reaction, every potential flaw in human perception. It was a masterpiece of calculation, and only someone attuned to both minute details and the broader patterns of behavior could hope to unravel it. Hamish's jaw tightened as he considered the implications. Knowing the motive gave him an advantage. It revealed the criminal's priorities, their fears, and their likely next moves. The person responsible craved control, sought attention through chaos, and would escalate further if challenged directly. But now, armed with this insight, Hamish could predict behavior, manipulate perception, and prepare for the confrontation that would inevitably come. The hidden motive, once obscured by layers of misdirection, had illuminated the heart of the crime, a chilling combination of intellect, obsession, and the need to dominate not merely events, but minds themselves. The detective rose from the table, determination settling over him like the winter dusk. The pattern was clear, the psychology understood, and the next step was imminent. The villain, for all their cunning and patience, had revealed themselves through the very subtlety that had made them so dangerous, and Hamish Macbeth, patient, perceptive, and relentless, was ready to bring the shadowed architect of the chaos into the light. Hamish spent the late evening preparing, moving silently through the manor as the frost deepened outside, covering the estate in a fragile, glittering blanket. Every detail he had observed, every pattern deduced from the past days, was carefully folded into his plan. The criminal had been meticulous, but Hamish had patience and foresight on his side, and he now understood precisely where the next move would unfold. Wallace's disappearance, the stolen notebook, the red ornament, and the silk thread, all threads of a web he was ready to pull taut. He summoned Fiona and Elspeth to the drawing-room, under a pretence of reviewing the day's events. The tension was tangible. Both women sensed that something decisive was imminent. Fiona maintained her composure, though the flicker of unease in her eyes betrayed a hint of fear. Elspeth's hands trembled slightly, the red silk thread she had unconsciously fidgeted with lying in her lap like a silent witness. Hamish allowed them to settle, observing their reactions minutely, before speaking with the calm authority that never invited interruption. "I believe," Hamish said slowly, "that someone among us has taken advantage of the Manor's routines, of our trust and of our fears. Someone has been orchestrating events carefully, manipulating reactions, and removing evidence to hide the truth. I also believe I know why." His gaze swept over the room, holding Fiona's eyes for a long moment, then Elspeth's, before returning to the ornament resting innocently on the mantel. "The motive is not merely money or inheritance, it is control, recognition, the satisfaction of proving that one mind can dominate, direct, and manipulate the lives of others without discovery." Fiona's hand twitched, brushing against the edge of the table, and Hamish noted the subtle tension in her shoulders. Elspeth's lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting to the window, then to the door, as if calculating the quickest route to safety. Hamish's gaze shifted to the empty spaces near the hearth and the corner where Wallace had been last seen, imagining how the criminal might react to the realization that their careful design was being unravelled. "I have also traced the patterns," Hamish continued, his voice measured, "and predicted the next move. Wallace has been taken, yes, but I know where, and I know why. The choices made, the timing, the paths followed, all reveal the perpetrator's obsession with control. And it is that very need, that very compulsion, which leaves them vulnerable." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, and then slowly reached into his coat pocket, producing the silver cufflink recovered from the garden. He held it in his hand, letting the light catch the engraved monogram, a quiet signal of both observation and patience. For a heartbeat, the room was silent, every person present absorbing the import of the gesture. Then Fiona's composure cracked, her voice sharp and incredulous. You can't know!" she exclaimed, rising from her chair, a mix of fear and fury flashing across her features. Her movements were deliberate, testing the room, searching for the opening she needed to assert control. Hamish remained still, his expression calm, unshaken, the subtle authority in his posture signalling that he would not be deterred. Elspeth shifted, uncertain, and Fiona seized the moment, stepping toward the door with sudden speed. Hamish's eyes followed, noting the trajectory, the angle, the habitual gestures she had revealed over the past days. "Stop," he said, calm but unwavering. The single word, simple yet authoritative, held weight. Fiona froze, momentarily, as if caught between instinct and calculation. Hamish advanced slowly, deliberately, allowing the room to constrain her options. "It's over," he said, voice low, precise. "Every move has been observed, every pattern anticipated. Wallace is safe, but only because I anticipated your next step. There is nowhere to hide, and no escape from the truth." Fiona's shoulders slumped slightly, a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. She realized that the net had been drawn with patient precision, that the evidence, the patterns, the subtle signals, and the psychological pressure had cornered her completely. For the first time, the meticulously crafted mask of control faltered. Hamish watched as she exhaled sharply, the tension bleeding away, and in that instant, the culmination of days of observation and deduction bore fruit. The criminal was revealed, defeated not by force, but by patience, insight, and the careful unravelling of a complex web of motives. Hamish stepped closer, eyes steady, voice firm but not unkind. "It's done. The night has ended, and the truth stands. The shadow you tried to cast is gone. Justice will follow, and the web you wove will unravel completely. He allowed the words to hang in the room, confident that the confession, if not spoken aloud, had been given by the body, the micro-expression. S, and the inevitable acknowledgement of control, lost. The manor exhaled with him, the long night finally giving way to the first quiet certainty since the mystery had begun. The manor was quiet in the fading twilight, the frost-covered grounds shimmering under a sliver of moonlight. Wallace had been located and returned safely, and Fiona had been restrained, her composure now replaced with a wary acknowledgement of defeat. Hamish felt the weight of the day's revelations settling like a heavy cloak. He believed the case was closed, the patterns understood, the criminal unmasked. Yet, instinct, honed by years of observing the subtle inconsistencies of human behaviour, whispered that the night was not yet done. He lingered in the drawing-room, examining the red ornament on the mantel for the 100th time, noting the way the light caught the edges of its inner message. The silk thread lay coiled beside it, now innocuous, yet in Hamish's mind each small detail carried the memory of its prior significance. He allowed his eyes to wander across the room, absorbing the placement of furniture, the faint dust trails, the slight scuff marks on the floor, habits, gestures, and minor alterations that might reveal more than the obvious. Something was off. Something had always been off. It was then that he noticed the ledger lying near the fireplace, its pages slightly ajar, revealing entries he had not studied in detail before. A subtle pattern emerged, a series of dates, small payments, and brief annotations that appeared almost irrelevant at first glance. Yet, when read in the context of the events of the past week, a new narrative began to form, one that challenged everything he had believed. The true orchestration had not been Fiona's alone. The meticulous orchestration, the subtle misdirection, the manipulation of reactions. These were signatures of another mind entirely. Hamish's pulse quickened as he pieced it together. Elspeth, the seemingly innocent and anxious housekeeper, had been present for every crucial moment. The discovery of the notebook, Wallace's observations, Fiona's reactions. She had handled the silk thread, delivered messages between rooms, and even guided Fiona's attention at key moments without drawing notice. Small gestures, her nervous fidgeting, the placement of the red ornament, her careful observation of Hamish's own reactions, were now unmistakably strategic. The very reactions he had credited to fear or innocence had been deliberate, subtle manipulations to direct attention elsewhere. Hamish rose, moving silently toward Elspeth, who was standing near the window, pretending to observe the frost-dappled garden. Her posture stiffened as he approached, a flicker of recognition passing across her eyes. "Hamish," she whispered, voice tight, I didn't." He held up a hand, calm, allowing the realization to settle without interruption. "You've been careful," he said slowly, painstakingly careful. Every step, every reaction, every small, seemingly inconsequential gesture has been designed to mislead. The notebook, the ornament, the silk thread, all orchestrated under the guise of fear, distraction, and subservience. Elspeth's composure faltered for the first time. Her lips parted, her hands twisting in the folds of her apron. I only wanted to protect her, to make sure she didn't get blamed for everything." Her voice trailed, the rationale clumsy yet revealing. She had believed that by manipulating perception she could shield Fiona from suspicion, but in doing so she had become the unseen architect, the mind guiding the chaos from the shadows. Hamish studied her carefully. "You thought you could control the narrative, hide in plain sight, and shape events without being noticed, and you almost succeeded. But the patterns, the details, the habits, they told a story you couldn't erase. You underestimated observation, anticipation, and the persistence of someone willing to see the truth, no matter how deeply buried." The silence in the room was thick, only broken by the soft creak of the frost-laden window frame as a draught swept through. Hamish's gaze swept across the once innocuous objects, the red ornament, the silk thread, the letter opener, each now understood as tools in a broader, more insidious plan. Elspeth's careful orchestration of reactions, her timing, and her subtle interventions revealed a mind both brilliant and wrestly precise. For a moment, the house seemed to exhale along with him. The final twist, the realization that the person everyone had dismissed as timid and fearful was the true manipulator, reshaped the entire narrative. Hamish felt the familiar thrill of insight, tempered by the awareness that the danger had never truly ended. The mastermind, previously hidden in plain sight, had been shaping events from the shadows, and it was only through painstaking observation and patient deduction that the truth had finally emerged. Hamish stepped closer, voice low but firm. "It's over now, Elspeth. The web you wove, the patterns you orchestrated, they've been uncovered. There is nowhere to hide, and no further control you can exert." Her shoulders slumped, the carefully constructed mask of cunning and control crumbling. Hamish knew then that the night, the chaos, and the deceptions that had stretched across days of frost and shadow had finally reached their conclusion. The real mind behind the mystery had been revealed, and the delicate balance of observation, patience, and insight had secured the truth, at last in full. The manor was quiet as Hamish led Elspeth from the drawing-room, her shoulders slumped and her hands clasped nervously before her. Outside, the frost glimmered under a waning moon, painting the grounds with the cold light of winter. Wallace had been returned, safely, Fiona remained under watchful custody, and now the final, unexpected mastermind stood revealed. Yet, as Hamish escorted Elspeth toward the waiting constables, he sensed that the night's story was not entirely concluded. There was a tension in the air, a subtle dissonance that hinted at lingering questions. Elspeth's eyes darted at every shadow, her movements cautious, as if measuring every step to ensure her continued control. Hamish watched her carefully, noting the lingering cunning in her gaze, the slight hesitations in her voice. Despite her surrender, the detective understood that the mind capable of such manipulation rarely surrendered fully. There remained a part of her that might yet act, if only in small, unpredictable ways. As the constables took her into custody, Hamish returned to the drawing-room, letting his eyes roam over the scene once more. The red ornament gleamed faintly in the lamplight, the silk thread lay coiled like a silent witness, and the faint scuff marks along the floor told the story of movements, interactions, and manipulations that had occurred over the past week. He allowed himself a small smile. Every clue had been deliberate, every gesture a test of perception, but in the end, observation and patience had triumphed. Hamish gathered Wallace and Fiona near the table, speaking quietly, almost to himself, yet allowing them to absorb the clarity of his reasoning. "The notebook's disappearance was not random," he began, fingers tracing the edges of the table where it had once rested. "It was removed to create confusion, to hide the true sequence of events, and to manipulate reactions. The red ornament, the silk thread, the small inconsistencies you noticed, they were not meaningless. Each was a deliberate instrument in the orchestration of fear and misdirection." He paused, letting his words sink in, then gestured toward the fireplace, where a faint smudge had seemed irrelevant in prior examinations. Even the smallest details were messages, hints of control and of power. Elspeth used them consciously and unconsciously to guide attention, provoke reactions, and shape perception. What seemed like fear was often strategy. What appeared as oversight was calculation, and it almost worked. Almost, but not entirely. Fiona's eyes widened slightly, understanding finally dawning. Wallace, still pale from the shock of his abduction, nodded, comprehension lighting his face. Hamish continued, calmly recounting the series of subtle signs that had betrayed the true mastermind, the careful placement of the ornament, the deliberate fidgeting with the silk thread, the timing of the red silk-s discovery, even the faint micro-expressions during questioning that revealed a mind quietly observing, calculating, and influencing every outcome. Yet, as he spoke, Hamish felt the weight of unfinished business. Though Elspeth had been restrained and Wallace safe, the sense of unease lingered. There was an inevitability to her cunning, a reminder that intellect like hers rarely vanishes entirely when contained. Justice had been served in the legal sense, arrests made, the chain of events exposed, but the subtle mastery she had exhibited left an unsettling residue. Hamish knew that in a different time, in a different place, such a mind could again exploit opportunity. He allowed himself a quiet reflection, tracing the steps that had brought him to this point. Every inconsistency, every subtle reaction, every seemingly minor habit had been a thread. It was the patient observation of these threads that had allowed him to anticipate movements, interpret hidden motives, and reveal the unseen hand guiding chaos. The notebook's theft, Wallace's disappearance, the deliberate misdirection, all of it had been decoded by not icing what others dismissed, by following the invisible patterns that only a keen eye could detect. As Hamish stepped toward the window, looking out over the frost-dappled estate, he felt a familiar satisfaction tempered with caution. Justice had been delivered, the intricate web of manipulation unravelled, yet the faint, lingering echo of the criminal's intellect remained, a reminder that human cunning could never be fully contained, only anticipated. Lochdubh would sleep more peacefully now, yet Hamish knew that vigilance, perception, and patience would always be necessary. The night had ended, the mystery revealed. But the subtle dance between observer and observed, manipulator and interpreter, would endure, and in that delicate balance, Hamish Macbeth remained, as always, one step ahead. The first rays of morning filtered weakly through the frost-laced windows of MacGregor Manor, painting long, cold lines across the floorboards. Hamish stood near the threshold of the front door, the manor behind him quiet and ordered once more. The constables had taken Elspeth into custody, Wallace was safely recovering, and Fiona, though shaken, had begun to regain her composure. Yet even in the seeming resolution, Hamish's instincts buzzed with a familiar tension. Something small, imperceptible to anyone else, still did not fit. He paused, glancing back at the drawing-room. The red ornament on the mantel caught his eye, the faint glimmer of its surface reflecting a fractured light. At first, he glanced. It appeared unchanged, harmless, a silent witness to the events that had transpired. But Hamish's practised gaze noticed a minuscule imperfection, a tiny scratch along its edge, almost invisible. It was too precise to be accidental, too subtle to be noticed by anyone who wasn't paying the closest attention. He frowned, turning the thought over in his mind. That scratch had not been there before the final confrontation. Someone, after all the chaos, had touched it, or left it. Hamish allowed his eyes to wander to the empty spaces near the fireplace, to the subtle dust trails on the polished floorboards, to the faintly dislodged frame of a painting in the hallway. Every detail he had catalogued over the past days told a story, but now, faintly, another story whispered just beneath the surface. A question lingered. Had he truly seen the whole picture, or had there been yet another hand influencing events, one that had remained just outside the light, leaving hints for the observant? He stepped outside into the crisp morning air, drawing a slow, steady breath. The frost glittered underfoot, the estate quiet but for the occasional creak of ice-laden branches. He could feel the weight of the past days, the murders, the disappearances, the carefully orchestrated deceptions, and yet, in that stillness, a sense of unfinished business pressed at him. Mystery had a habit of lingering, of hiding in plain sight, and Hamish knew better than to assume finality. As he walked down the frost-dusted path toward the village, he reflected on the tiny clues that had been missed, the subtle manipulations that had almost gone unnoticed. A misplaced key, a micro-expression, the sequence of gestures that revealed more than words ever could. All of it had been part of the intricate dance he had navigated. And now, with Elspeth apprehended, Wallace safe and Fiona unharmed, the case was closed in the legal sense, but in the realm of perception, of human subtlety, the game never truly ended. Hamish's mind wandered to the ledger and the faintly inscribed letters, the hidden grievances and minor signals that had shaped events. He thought of the faint scratch on the ornament and the pattern of the silk thread, both seemingly inconsequential, yet potent reminders that attention to the smallest details could reveal or conceal the truth. Someone had left these subtle markers intentionally, perhaps as a message, perhaps as a challenge. He could not know yet, but he could feel the pulse of intention behind them. A quiet smile touched his lips as he passed the manor gates, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots. Justice had been served, lives had been spared, and the immediate threat had been neutralized. Yet the shadow of curiosity, the thrill of observation, and the endless interplay between human cunning and perception lingered. He knew the peace was temporary, mystery by its nature, had a persistence that defied resolution. There would always be another case, another subtle deception to unravel, another puzzle hidden within the ordinary. Hamish paused at the edge of the path, looking back at the manor one last time. The frost shimmered faintly, the shadows stretched long and silent, and somewhere within the quiet he sensed the faintest echo of secrets still unspoken. The red ornament caught his eye once more, its imperfection glinting like a subtle wink, as if to remind him that the night's lessons were not yet complete. Mystery, he knew, never truly ended. With a steadying breath, Hamish Macbeth continued down the path toward Lochdubh village, the manor fading behind him, the frost sparkling like a final promise. The world was full of secrets, and there would always be another shadow to follow, another pattern to discern, and another truth to reveal.